So Hilchot Tsitsit, Siman Yud Aleph. We are doing, here's the sheets. Anybody wants sheets? We got sheets for you for Hilchot Tsitsit. We are going to continue where we were last time, and hopefully those who are not able to make it will catch up. So if Aleph, we are this Siman is Dinei Chute Atzitzit. So we are talking about the strings of the Tzitzit. So this is a little bit technical, but not too technical. So the first halakha is that that tzitzit, and we learned this in the Rambam already, that the tzitzit have to be, the strings have to be spun l'shem mitzvah, which means you cannot simply go to AC Moore or wherever you buy art supplies, I don't know where you go, and buy some kind of string, let's say wool string, and tie it into tzitzit. It has to be spun l'shem mitzvah tzitzit. Haga, the Rama says, v'yesh mahmirin afilu lenapetzan lishman, ve'amenag le'akel beniputz. He says there are some who say that you even have to comb the wool l'shem mitzvah, which means that's a step prior to spinning it. First you comb it to get out all of the impurities, all of the other material, the waste product out of the wool to make it smooth so that you can spin it. So you remove whatever kind of extraneous matter is in there. So some say you have to do even that lishma because that's part of the process of spinning. But we don't require that though. But the point is that you can't get regular string. It has to be string made. So if you want to make your own tzitziot, you have to actually order, the strings that are made the shem mitzvah tzitzit. Which means sheyomar b'tchilat hativui shu osek en the shem tzitzit. Which means in the beginning of spinning the strings, you have to say, I am doing this for the sake of the mitzvah tzitzit. Or sheyomar leisha tevili tzitzit latalit. Or if a lady is making the tzitzit, you tell her, please do this l'shem tzitzit, for the sake of tzitzit. V'im lo ayu tivuyin l'shman pesulim. If they were not made l'shem mitzvah, so in other words, you don't necessarily have to personally make the tzitzit. A woman could make it even though she's not obligated in the tzitzit. She can make the tzitzit. She can spin the string to make it into strings for tzitzit, as long as it's done l'shem mitzvah. So you cannot get regular ordinary strings. So if Bet says tiva'an nochri, if a non-Jewish person spins the threads, v'Yisrael omed al gabo ve'omer sheyaseh lishma, and a Jew is supervising. So you have let's say in a kosher restaurant, you might have a non-Jewish chef, but a mashgiach. So let's say you had a factory for making the strings for the tzitzit. You're spinning the thread to make tzitzit, and non-Jewish worker is actually making the tzitzit, but you are omed al gabo, means you are supervising. You have a mashgiach, basically, who stands over there and says, this is all being done for the sake of the mitzvah. So he says you have a machloket here, leha Rambam pasul. According to the Rambam, it's no good. It has to be that a Jew actually spins the tzitzit, because it says, ve'asul daber el bnei Yisrael ve'amarta alehem ve'asul lahem tzitzit. We learned this in the Rambam already. It says, speak to the children of Israel and they should make tzitzit. So if we're considering the spinning of the threads to be the first step in the making of tzitzit, and it has to be the shem mitzvah, it has to be for the sake of the mitzvah. So the Rambam says you can't have non-Jews spin the threads even, because that's part of the mitzvah. It's part of preparing it. However, the Rosh says...
I asked Rabbi Chait this question.
What did he say?
In 1973. What do you think he said? No.
You can't do it.
Because he always held to the Rambam.
Yeah, that's 40 years ago maybe changed. The Rabbasul, leharosh kasher, according to the Rosh, who was also, he was Ashkenazi actually, but he was the rabbi of the Sephardic community. He said it's kasher as long as a Jew stands there and is saying, this is done for the sake of the mitzvah. What does the Rama say? So the Rama says, v'noagin, the custom, I guess, in Poland was, sheyisayeh ha'Yisrael me'at, that the Jew helps a little bit. So this is similar to the issue of Bishul Akum, where you have the Jew helping a little bit to make it Jewish cooking. So he helped a little bit. So there are other cases where you find that when a Jew has to be involved in the process, as long as the Jew is involved a little bit, that's enough. With regard to tefillin and sefer Torah. So there's a machloket basically. So obviously, because it's a machloket of great significance, we try to be stringent in this. And obviously, in a case where we have no options, we can be lenient. But we try to make the whole mitzvah be done by somebody who is obligated in the mitzvah. and not rely on the idea that a mashgiach is going to stand over them and say all of this is being done l'shem mitzvah, for the sake of the mitzvah. Utzrichin, and here we come upon a major debate. Shizira. Shizira means that you, what's the term for that in English? Where you take threads, maybe you'll know. Twining, is that the word, twining? That you take individual threads and you wrap them into a thick thread. What do you call that? In other words, you make a thick thread,
cable.
Right, that's made out of multiple threads. So, for example, it says in the building of the Mishkan, when they build the Mishkan, they build the tabernacle, so the threads were shizurim, moshzar, it always says, which means that it wasn't a single thread, but it was multiple threads that were made into a thick type of a thread. That's called shizirah.
It gives it extra strength.
Right, it gives it more strength. So the Rambam said, if you want to make it shazur, that's okay. If you don't want to, that's also okay. But most of the commentaries argue with this Rambam and say it must be shizurim. They must be made like that it's multiple threads made twisted. Maybe that's the word. Yeah, twisting it into a thicker thread. It has to be like that. So he says, tzrichin shizira ushiu shizurin lishman. That it requires shizira. It has to be twisted into a thick thread, and that also has to be done l'shem mitzvah. So since just like the making of the individual threads has to be done l'shem mitzvah, the blending of those threads together, or the spinning of those threads together into a thicker thread, is also part of that process and has to be done l'shem mitzvah, according to the Shulchan Aruch. Now again, the Rambam said that that's not necessary, but there are many, many sources that are brought by the other Rishonim to argue on the Rambam and to say that actually it's required. So now if you look at any Tsitsit, you will see, I should have brought a talit to show you. I'll just grab a talit from the room to show you. This might not be the best example because these tzitzit are really short, but they're not very thick. But if you look really closely, you'll see that it's twisted from many. See how it's twisted? You can see how it's twisted from many individual threads. If anybody wants to take a look at that, you can. And that's the way that it's done. So, so what happens? You have the following problem. How many strings are you supposed to have in each one of your corners? Well, it comes out to be 8. It's really 4 folded in half, right? It's 4 folded in half, right, over the corner, right? So it's really 4. Now, what happens if each one of those 4, they're blended actually from other strings, right? And let's say actually they're blended from 4 strings each, right? Or even if they're blended only from 2 strings each, doesn't matter. Now they become undone. So what are you going to have? Multiple ones. So he says you have 16 now, let's say. So either because they're blended from, let's say if you look at it as 8 strings blended as 2 strings in each, so then it would be 16 that way. Or it could mean that each one is made of 4 fibers and they split and now you have 16 in total. But it doesn't matter. The point is that you've multiplied the number of strings that you have hanging down because this special thick thread that you created from the thinner threads is becoming undone. That's all. So he says that kisherim, it doesn't affect it. As long as there's a little bit on top that's still intact in the original form, it's good. In other words, since he requires it to be shazur, that it has to be blended from multiple threads, it can't just be a single string. So if the whole thing is undone, it's not pasul, it's not invalid because you have too many strings. It's invalid because the strings are not twined together. Because they aren't made together, because they're single strings. That's the problem. And he requires that each string be blended from multiple strings. That's the difficulty. So he says, if it comes undone, then kedei aniva means the end, that there has to be enough on the string that you could make a bow at the end. In other words, that you could bend it over and make a bow. If there's enough that you could bend it to make a bow, the shape of a bow, okay, then that's considered that there's still a piece of string there. That's kedei aniva.
So my talit had like 2 long strings. So I cut them.
Yeah.
And now, and I looked at it a couple days ago, and it seems like
it's unraveling.
Yeah.
So that could be a problem. As long as there's enough left on the top that there's still kedei aniva, which means there's enough left that's still intact that you could fold it basically into a bow. Okay, now I think in this book he gives like exact measurements for how much each of these, measurements, like in terms of numbers. But the reason why they gave measurements like the amount that it takes to make a bow is not because they wanted you to have to look in another book to tell you how many millimeters that is. It's because they actually thought that you could just check by seeing how to make a bow. So it's a reliable rule of thumb. If there's a technical amount that they've standardized it, that's very helpful for using as a guideline. But the reality is that it follows the amount of string that it takes to make a bow. Now you might say, well, I like to make really big bows that are really cute. Another guy likes to make a small bow. So what kind of bow are we talking about here? Okay, so that's where questions might come in. Now, he says, so we're going to see later that what they do is actually, if you look very closely, most of the strings are knotted at the bottom, so that the shizur doesn't come undone, so that this blending doesn't come undone. You'll see there's a little tiny knot at the bottom.
That's what he can do also.
Yeah, you can do that in yours also. So here we get into a big also machloket, that there's a big discussion about how long did tzitzit have to be. So we're used to seeing them pretty long. Can I have that back? Because I want to show you a demonstration of what it's talking about when I get to it. I wish I didn't have this talid, because this talid is not very good. In fact, you know what? I'm going to get a better. I'm just going to get my talid. Better. So, now, the question's like this. So, every talid, the tzitzit are always made of two things. They're made of something that's called the gedil and the anaf. The gedil is the part that's what's the word? Braided, basically. Okay. In other words, this part, and the hanging part is called the anaf. Now, the rule that the Talmud gives us is that, as a general rule, 2/3 should be the free flowing part, and 1/3 of the length should be the braided part. So there should always be this proportion. And the other piece of information that we have is that it should be 4 thumb widths in its length, okay? So 1, 2, 3, 4, that's a minimum amount, okay? It could be more, but that's a minimum amount. So he says here, Orech hachutim hashmona en pachot midalet gudalim. That's 4 thumbs, okay? But the only problem is, which part of it has to be 4 thumbs? And just like in many areas of halakha, when there are multiple possibilities, at least one person, decides to go with every one of the possibilities. So what are the 3 possibilities here? Either 4 thumb widths is the minimum amount of the entire thing. Now remember, there are 2 parts. Or 4 thumb widths is just the amount of this, the hanging part. Or 4 thumb widths is the amount of the braided part. So which were they referring to? Now, there's a big difference depending on how you look at it. Now, obviously, if it's 4 thumb widths on the entire thing, that's pretty short. Okay? If it's 4 thumb widths on the braided part, now remember, the braided part is only supposed to be 1/3 of the total, which means that your entire thing will be, who remembers their math? 12, right? So, and that's why he has here. So he says, it shouldn't be less than 4 thumb widths. V'yesh omrim yud bet gudalim, and some say 12. Why 12? Because the 12 means that 4 thumb widths only for this part, but this part's only supposed to be 1/3. So that means that this must be another 8 thumb widths. And basically, obviously, this is more than that because that's a minimum. Okay, but the proportion is essential, and the minimum is essential. The maximum, there is no maximum. Okay, so you have 2 views here. Now and he brings these, he brings the sources in the Bet Yosef, and basically the way that we practice today is v'chen noagin. The latter view is the view in practice, that we take the more stringent view. Even though the Rambam would seem to say that the whole thing only has to be 4 thumb widths long, it doesn't matter. In practice, the way that we do it is, we do the 12 thumb widths with the top part being 4, and that's not a problem because since there's no maximum, it doesn't affect us, it doesn't hurt us in any way to have it longer than it needs to be. It would only hurt us if we had it shorter than it needed to be, and in this case we're erring on the side of caution, so to speak, and we're making sure that it's at least as long as it would have to be, if not longer. So we're okay with going with the number 12. So he says here, So when he defines the thumb width, does he have that here? Maybe it's not here. Okay, we'll see later then. Okay, so then he says like this: Ulemala in lahem shiur. They don't have any maximum. So now what the Rama adds here, and this is true. Aroch yoter. Let's say a person made it too long. He doesn't like it. He thinks it's too long. So you might think it's too holy to cut it. But what do you do now? So he says, no problem. You can just cut it. Now we learned earlier that if you have something, if you tie the tzitzit and then you cut them, that's no good, because you tied, when you put them into the corner, let's say there were not enough. In other words, let's say you have a situation where you hung it in two corners or whatever this is. You had that case where you hung the strings across two corners, and then you tied them in each corner, and then you cut it in the middle to make it a total of the right number. So in other words, you ended by cutting. You're not allowed to do that. But what you are allowed to do is, if the tzitzit is totally fine, you can shorten it. You're allowed to cut it to shorten it. There's no problem with that at all. So he says, obviously you have to make one of these strings longer than the others in order to tie the braided part. The braided part has to be tied with one of the strings, and the string has to be longer than the others. I should say achelek, not echalak. Achelek me'atzitzit she'eno arog. That hagedil means the part of the tzitzit she'eno arug. It's a strange way of speaking, because really, actually, the gedil is the part that is braided. The measurements that we talk about in tzitzit are in addition to, he says, milvad ma shemunach al keren habeged, which means to say that if you look at the corner of the beged, you don't count this part in the length, because this part doesn't protrude from the garment. Only the part that protrudes from the garment is included in the quantitative measurement. We don't look at the part that overlaps with the garment itself. Okay? Now, I'm not sure why he says that hagedil hainu hachelek me'atzitzit she'eno arug, because it should be the opposite. Hagedil, usually when we say the gedil is the braided part. So I'm a little bit confused by what that could be, a typo. Eno sin hatzitziot me'atzemer anechaz bakotzim. We don't make tzitzit from wool that's nechaz bakotzim, that we find on the thorns. In other words, the sheep walk around and their hair gets pulled off by thorns, and you go into the thorns, you collect, that's used for the tzitzit. Kishatzon rovetzim benehem. We don't take it from hair that detached from an animal. And we don't take it from the leftover. Let's say that the weaver leaves something at the end of a garment. We don't take it from the leftovers from a garment used for our tzitzit. Why not? Because of bizui mitzvah. It's not respect for the mitzvah to use basically what we would consider to be trash. Something that's, we would never go to the thorn bush and pull off pieces of wool to make our clothes from that. Okay, we wouldn't take the pieces that fall off of the animal. You shear the animal in the normal way, and you utilize what you shear from the animal to make anything of significance. So we wouldn't consider these sort of discarded items as valuable enough to make tzitzit out of them, and therefore one is not allowed to make tzitzit out of these detached or the things that had fallen off of the animal or were left over after a garment was made, whatever was left over and abandoned from the garment that was made. So he says now, you cannot steal thread and make tzitzit out of it, because it says v'asulahem tzitzit. It has to be something that you made mi shelahem, as it says on the next page. Mi shelahem, it has to be yours. Haggah, it says in the Ramah, v'davka shegazal chutin, aval im gazal tzemer v'asa'an chutin kesherim miu asul lechatchila asul lasatam. We should know that already, right? In other words, we have a concept of mitzvah haba'a ba'avera. Mitzvah haba'a ba'avera means you can't do a mitzvah through an avera. We don't do a mitzvah through a sin. So what does a mitzvah through a sin mean in this case? If you steal Okay, if you steal the strings and you make the tzitzit out of the stolen strings, so that's pasul. It has to be mishalahem. It has to be something that rightfully belongs to you. However, the halachot of stealing are very nuanced. You think that there are loopholes in halachot of Shabbat, in halachot of kashrut, in every other area. Guess what? There are loopholes even in the laws of stealing. Now, they don't exempt the thief from paying back what he stole. But let's say, for example, you steal wheat from somebody, and you grind the wheat and you make it into bread. Okay? Now, obviously, you did a sin stealing the wheat and making it into bread, and that's a terrible thing. But you return now to the person the value of what you stole. You don't return to them bread, because you didn't steal bread. You stole wheat. That's called shinui. When you have a change in the form, so now what ends up happening is you have a monetary obligation. You don't return the bread, because maybe the guy didn't want bread. You don't know that the guy wanted bread. But once it changes, it's no longer the article you stole anymore. So too, he says, if you stole wool, raw wool, and you made it into tzitzit, so then it's already changed its form. So now you would have to obviously pay the person back, but we wouldn't look at that item as the stolen article anymore because it's changed form. You're still a thief and you still owe the guy money back, but we wouldn't say that the tzitzit are pasul. However, if you stole the strings from the guy, you broke into the tzitzit guy's house and you stole the strings, and you made from that tzitzit, we would say you have to return the tzitzit right now. The strings themselves, you can never use them. But when they undergo a change in form, so as it's a loophole basically in a sense that the item no longer has the status of a stolen object, you just have a monetary obligation at that point. Just like if, for example, you stole a car and you went to a chop shop, and everything was reduced to whatever, and you sold all the parts, you could argue that there's no car anymore. So each one of those items now is no longer really the thing that you stole. Because let's say you melted it down and you made it into a lump of metal and you made it into something else. So now, even though you have it illicitly, it's not the item you stole anymore. So that's just a law in Ilchot Gezelah. It doesn't really directly have to do with tzitzit. He says, Chutin she'ulin halva'ahi dilah hadrei be'inayu uchidideh dameh. What happens if you... Now, we said that the tzitzit has to belong to you. In order to say a beracha, it has to belong to you. What if you borrowed the strings? You said, hey, I'd like to borrow some strings from you because I want to make tzitzit. So we don't assume that you're actually going to return. It's like if you say to somebody, could I borrow a cup of sugar? Has anybody ever borrowed a cup of sugar before? A cup of flour, a cup of sugar, right? You go to some neighbor, you say, can I borrow a cup of sugar? Are they expecting that cup of sugar back? Hopefully not. And the form that it would come in wouldn't be something they would want. So therefore, when we borrow that, it's called halva'ah, which means what are you going to return to them? Money or some other sugar another time. You're not going to return that to them. So when somebody gives you strings, you say, hey, can I borrow some of that string? I want to make my own tzitzit, and they give it to you. They're not planning on ever seeing that string again, are they? They're planning on you're going to compensate them. So we consider that yours now because you borrowed it, but it was a permanent loan insofar as the strings are concerned because you're never going to give those strings back. So they are yours, halachically. You just owe money or replacement strings to the person who gave it to you, but they never plan on actually seeing those strings again. This is a halakha that we'll most likely never have to encounter. If you worship an animal, Simra pasula tzitzit, or tsamra pasula tzitzit, its wool is now invalidated for tzitzit because you made it into an object of idolatrous worship, and that's a no-no. However, if you bow down to a flax plant in the ground, you cannot make it into an object of idolatry because there's a really interesting halakha in idolatry, in the laws of idolatry, that something which doesn't have tefisat yad ha'adam, which means a man doesn't have, it's not part of a human domain. You can't change its status to become an object of idolatry. And you know why it's a really good thing that we have this halakha? Because we would never be able to go out in the sun otherwise. Because since people worship the sun, it would be an object of idol worship and we'd never be allowed to use it again. Or people worship the stars, we would never be allowed to use it again. Or people worship any other natural item that's planted in the ground, we would never be able to worship to utilize it again because it would all be considered object of idolatry. So if somebody bows to a cow or bows to a sheep, the wool on the sheep that's detachable that has the status of being worshipped, because you worship the wool was part of the animal and it's walking around. But something that's planted in the ground and growing, we'll say that until it's detached from the ground, the person doesn't have the power to make it into their idolatrous object yet. Once it's detached and they worship it, now you have an issue. So for instance, at the Eucharist or something like that, where the priest bows down to the cracker. I don't know if you've ever watched Catholic Mass before, but you weren't Catholic. You were Catholic.
I was in Catholic school my entire life.
Oh, I didn't know you were Catholic. Okay.
I'm not Catholic.
Oh, you're not. But now you're not.
I went to Catholic school.
Oh, you went to Catholic school, but your family wasn't Catholic.
No.
Okay.
Methodist.
Methodist. Yeah, I didn't think so. Yeah. Well, yeah. So when they bowed to the wafer and everything, that for sure makes it, into an object of worship. I mean, they just bowed to it, so that's pretty clear. But the people who bowed to the sun or the moon or a flax plant don't change a plant in nature into an object of idolatry.
According to your explanation, the Asherah tree
was planted for that purpose. That's why. Yeah, that's yeah. So the Asherah tree, if something's actually planted so it was created to be an idol worship. That's different. Yeah, okay. But the sun wasn't put there to be idol worship. Hashem was that was put there to put light or something. Okay. So now the Seif Tet, Ya'aseh nekev ve'orech hatalit. Lo lemala megimal etzbaot. So now we learn, where do you put? In other words, we know that the tzitzit have to go on the corner of the talit. So what's considered corner? Is this the corner? How do you know where to draw the line in corner, right? It's all square, so what about here? Is this the corner? It's somewhat relative, right? What we define as corner. So what they define as corner is, it should be not more than 3 thumbs breadths. Let's test if the person who made this did it right. 1, 2, 3. It's right in the middle of that third thumb. So that's where it should be, correct? So it should be within 3 thumbs of the edge of the garment to still be considered at the edge. Mipnei she'eno nikra kanaf, because anything higher than that is not the corner anymore. Velo lemata mikashiur sheyesh mikesher gudal ad tziporen, and this amount from the knuckle until the what do you call this, fingernail. So from the knuckle of the thumb to the fingernail, that amount of space, it shouldn't be less than that amount of space. So there's a minimum amount of space that it has to be away from the edge, and there's a maximum amount of space that it's allowed to be away from the edge. So it has to be within this range. And he says, however, right, shenemar, mishum shenemar ala kanaf. It has to be on the corner. If it's too close to the edge, then the whole thing is going to hang under the corner. It's not really going to be on the corner. So having a little bit of space here, see this? So because you have some space here, part of it is hanging actually on the corner. If it were all the way down here, the entire thing would be off the corner. So you don't want it to be so far that it's not at the corner. You don't want it to be so low that none of it is touching the corner. So you have it right here so that it's touching the corner but also hanging down, and that accomplishes both goals. We don't use a diagonal measure, we use a straight measure to determine where it goes. Now, now let's say what happens is I wear this talit a long time, and over the years this wears down. It wears down so much that actually now there's only a tiny bit of space left. So when I hung these tzitzit like this, there was this amount of space, but it's worn down, so there's only a tiny amount of space at the edge of the garment between where the tzitzit is supposed to hang. So there's nothing left. So what do I do now if it wears down like that? He says, since it was okay when you put it in, we don't invalidate it now. We say that the amount that's just an amount for when you place the tzitzit. But if your talit wears out, and falls apart a little bit over the years, we don't invalidate it after the fact. It stays valid forever. Haggah the Rama says, "V'noagin lasot imra seviv hanekev shelo yinatek sham v'yeh pachot mikashiur v'chen osin imra b'svat habeged lemata mehai ta'ama." He says, for this reason we usually put a border. Sometimes they would put a border inside the hole where the tzitzit is placed, right? So that it won't, reinforcement basically, so that it won't wear out over here, and reinforcement on the edge of the garment so that the garment won't wear out over here. So that's why if you look, usually they do have a little bit of a border so that these problems don't emerge. V'yesh omrim shebetoch rochav habeged en lo shiur. V'yesh omrim shedin rochav habeged kedin ha'orech v'nir'in divrehem. Some say that the only measurement of distance, so we said that there has to be a certain measurement of distance from the edge of the garment, a minimum amount that it can't be, and a maximum amount that it can't be. There's a range. So some say that only applies to the length of the garment, because when you put tzitzit, you put them to the length of the garment, like this. You don't put them this way. You put them this way. Okay? So you always put them to the length. So some say that there's no length measurement from the other end. In other words, it's only this way that you have to worry. You only have to worry to the length. You don't have to worry how far it is from the other edge. And some say that you have to worry the same. And he says, and that's what makes sense. So therefore, what do we apply? You'll notice that this is basically equidistant, right? The amount of distance from this edge to the tzitzit placement is the same as the amount of distance from this edge to the tzitzit, because we make it exactly even. It's equidistant. So we fulfill that way that it's at the corner of the garment precisely. Okay? So I think this is a good place to stop. And Be'ezrat Hashem will continue here next week. Do we have a second issue?